first episode of Christian Debate Short Response, where I thought about giving the title Long Debate Short Response, except every Christian debate is a long debate. I am Michael the Man Behind the Machine, and I'm doing a solo show here for your pleasure, and my goal is to make a long Christian debate short for your understanding. This is not an unbiased show, so I warn you right now that I'll have my own opinions, but I want to make a big debate short and digestible for any of you who don't want to sit through 3 hours debate. Forewarning, I'm going to give some clips from the debate that I'm going to go over today, and it's going to be at 2x speed because that's how I live my life. So if that's too fast for you, you can slow down the video, you can slow down me. I talk pretty fast myself in real life, so that might be beneficial all around. The debate topic for today, it's called The Baptism Debate. You can look it up on YouTube. It is between James White and Gregg Strawbridge, who both of them have names, doctors, reverends, whatever. I'm going to skip all names for future debates just because I might get them wrong, so I'm not going to call Dr. White, and I'm not going to call Reverend Strawbridge, just Strawbridge and White. First of all, before I get into it, I want to go over the topic. This is over infant baptism, which sounds like a really exciting opener for this series. Of course, it doesn't sound like that at all, but it's extremely important as an in-house debate within Christianity. And I say that with emphasis because I think that we can make things that aren't very important. And this is a debate between Christians, there's no doubt. This is not between an unbeliever and a believer, and so there's a certain amount of animus that presents itself because it's an in-house debate, and brothers fight a little bit more viciously than non-brothers sometimes, but there's also a certain amount of camaraderie that I won't be showcasing here in this short snippet, but I promise you if you watch the full 3-hour debate, you will see it in spades. So don't think that this is two unbelievers fighting each other or an unbeliever versus a non-believer, so show that kind of respect when you're listening. But I bring this up as the opening question, not only because we are doing an episode on it, me and Sebastian, on the full Found Cause podcast, which you can look to on episode 23 coming out soon. We will be doing an in-depth analysis of what infant baptism is, the different defenses of it, and why we both disagree with it. But I'll tell you that the reason I chose this is it's an important issue amongst some of the strongest believers out there right now. For example, John Calvin laid some of the foundation for today's infant baptism supporters, and John Calvin is, of course, extremely influential in the Reformed Christian movement, which is a resurging, powerful Christian movement here in the United States. And some of the strongest members and voices of that movement are Presbyterians. Doug Wilson, radical, extreme, old man out in Ohio, he is a Presbyterian. Some of the strongest churches in the United States historically have been Presbyterian. In the American Revolution, the Presbyterian Revolt is what it was called by the British on occasion, and it was Presbyterian ministers who fought at the Battle of Lexington and conquered, and it's been Presbyterians who have held the Reformed position in American life when Baptists have gone up and down. For example, the Southern Baptist Convention was Reformed, then became unreformed, and then has reformed again, and I think it's due to the faithful ministering of Presbyterians. So with all love towards the Presbyterian Church, you're going to hear my opinion is that I disagree with infant baptism, and that's going to color my reaction to this debate. But first, I want to play you a clip. I'm going to give you 3 sections of the debate because most debates are broken up into roughly 3 sections. Opening, I'll play a clip right now, and then the rebuttals, which I'll play a clip from, and then closing plus Q&A plus cross-examination, which typically, in case you've never seen a debate before, the opening is pretty boring, the rebuttal is interesting, and the cross-examination is where things get crazy. And that's usually when you determine a winner, if you're going to pick a winner. So before I go any further, let me give you a clip that defines the opening remarks from Dr. White.
Nowhere is this principle more important than the definition of the New Covenant itself. Reformed Baptists believe, we insist, that only the New Covenant documents can properly interpret and apply the Old Covenant prophecies about the New Covenant. Hence, when Hebrews 8 makes the supremacy and present reality of the New Covenant part of its very apologetic argument, no amount of Old Covenant sameness argumentation can be allowed to undo the author's primary point. I think that's very, very important to emphasize. When Hebrews 8 tells us that the New Covenant is currently present, it is here, it is the very essence of its argument about going back to the old ways, we cannot then change the nature of the New Covenant when we try to force Old Covenant paradigms upon the New Testament church. We must allow the explicit teaching of the New Testament of the nature of the New Covenant, its central place, and then reason downward from this clear revelation to the application of covenant signs, etc. Not the other direction. You don't come up with an idea of covenant signs and then reason from there to the nature of the covenant. You start with what the Bible teaches about the covenant and then move downward from there. Excuse me. We cannot begin with Old Covenant paradigms and applications and then force them onto the fuller New Covenant reality. For in so doing, we end up fundamentally compromising the fullness of the New Covenant and altering its essential perfection and its completion.
So you can see there that White has a way of always trying to lay the groundwork for a debate whenever he opens a debate, and you'll probably see this. I'm planning to do a ton of Dr. White debates because James White is a prolific debater, and one of my personal favorites, so I'm going to show some bias and review at least 10 of his debates in this series, so you're going to have to hang with me. Anyways, you'll see something that's very present in all of his debates, in that he likes to lay out the terms for who wins and who loses, and you'll see that in this opening snippet, he says that consistency in hermeneutics, how you read the text and what techniques you use, that's going to be who determines the winner, because both sides are clearly articulate, they can tell stories well, but consistency is what's going to win the day. And a famous line from Dr. White is that inconsistency is the sign of a failed argument. Gregg, on the other hand, not that you heard it in this clip, but I'll just lay out the opening statement. Gregg, he lays out a story of covenantal theology. He goes through a big story, a big positive case for infant baptism, and this is a typical technique you'll see as far as people trying to create a moving story, because it sounds nice on paper and it writes well in blogs, but I don't typically see it work well in debate, and I don't think there's an exception here. It's great for the opening remark, but as soon as it's rebutted, it falls apart. So he tries a story with the covenant that God makes with Abraham all the way down to the covenant he ends up making with the new covenant people after Jesus, and tries to say that the baptism is a sign of that new covenant, and the old covenant was given to people who didn't end up being saved, and therefore the baptism should be given to new covenant people who still possibly won't end up being saved, i.e. children. Gregg also says that children are not excluded, and you'll hear this throughout the debate. He says, this doesn't say that children are excluded. He constantly says that, which I think is a twisting, because no one said, including White, he did not say that children were excluded. He says that they just have to believe. There's no attack on children here. It's a necessity of belief. So when Gregg talks about children not being excluded, it's really a misnomer. It's that those who haven't professed are excluded. Lastly, in the opening statement, White points to key texts which his opponent believes are strong and points out why they are wrong. And then he also gives a positive approach to why he believes in believers' baptism. This, I think, is a much more well-rounded opener than Gregg, although Gregg's was fluent and, again, stands fine on its own, especially good for a blog post, but perfectly fine in debate. The more well-rounded approach, where you not only give your positive affirmation, but also rebuke your opponent's affirmation, is the best way to go, and White showing his experience by doing that perfectly here. Next clip I'm going to show you is the middle of the debate. This is during their rebuttals against each other, and this is a snipe that Dr. Gregg gets on. Just to be fair to him, this is pretty good.
He will speak words to you by which you will be saved, you and your household. I don't see how the Reformed Baptist should expect this to be written in, except to say, well, this is extraordinary. This is amazing. This is very unusual. This is an exceptional case, except that there are 9 individuals. 5 are household cases. 2 don't have households, Simon the sorcerer and Gaius. The best bet for the Baptist position is Simon the sorcerer.
So there you go. Gregg gets a good one, gets a chuckle from the crowd. Gregg emphasizes households being saved, and that's kind of throughout his rebuttal. He emphasizes households being saved, and that is it's a powerful promise of the gospel when sharing to unbelievers. That's strange to me, especially when I first heard this debate, because I wouldn't think that this would bleed into the gospel, but you can kind of see why this is an important topic and why they even took it up, because Gregg really believes this is important when sharing with, like, Muslims, for example, who Dr. White talks to a lot. This is important to adding to the gospel that even their household will be saved, which is interesting, and if you're not from that tradition, might be a little disturbing. Gregg also states that there's only a couple personal baptism stories in the scripture, and so then he builds his argument off 5 of those are for households, and only 4 of them aren't, and some of them are Simon the sorcerer, which he ends with there, which I think is a pretty good sting, except that he doesn't talk about the 3,000 that are baptized. He does, he just ignores them in this stat that he gives, which we will see later in the debate. White plays on this. When he gives his rebuttal, he talks about the 3,000 that believed were baptized in the household. So they didn't have any households. They were just 3,000. He also points out that the households of those baptized in several instances rejoiced along with the husband that was baptized, which would be strange if they hadn't accepted the gospel. Very strange if somebody who didn't believe was rejoicing that somebody did believe. Instead, the thought is that all in the household accepted him and therefore were baptized. Gregg gives this memorable jab, like I just showed you, but White ends up getting the last word because, first of all, he goes second, which is always an advantage in a debate, but White gets the last word with a closer as he goes back to hermeneutics. Like he opened the debate with, he goes and clinches on hermeneutics. How are you going to read the text? And that being part of the new covenant would forgive sins. So if you say that children are part of the new covenant, you are saying that God has forgiven their sins on the basis of their parents' faith, which is not Gregg's belief and would be a rebuke of the terms of covenant baptism. White also clinches this section of the debate by saying that offspring is used in Isaiah 53 when talking about Jesus, that the Messiah would see his offspring. So when Gregg points out that offspring is a promise in the New Testament, that you and your children will see things, that your offspring will inherit this promise, that when Jesus' offspring is considered it's spiritual, why not apply this to spiritual offspring as well? So that's the rebuttals. And we're going to move on to the much more spicy section. And this debate particularly gets exciting in the cross-examination and then the Q&A, particularly the cross-examination. And there's a principle that I'd like to lay out here in case you're ever thinking about debates or watching them. There's a phrase that the first one to sweat is the first one to lose. Because if you start being flustered by your opponent's attacks, you're often going to start relying on emotion, and typically emotion, unless it's very focused, does not work well in blogs, in debates, in every rhetoric known to man, and this is no exception here, as you'll see in the next two clips. So let me give you two clips from the rebuttals and cross-examination.
I think it's very relevant to infant baptism.
But I believe God has just as much freedom to save infants in infancy and those who don't have the capacity that he has to save adults. And so I do believe there's such things as elect infants. Can I prove that? I don't believe the Bible addresses it with enough clarity to prove it. Can anyone disprove it? I don't think they can either. I just don't believe in the automatic, as long as you're not a certain age, you go to heaven idea. I don't see a basis for that. And I don't see a basis for the other extreme, saying that there is no way for God to be free in his giving of grace to those who die in infancy. I think he has the same freedom to save those as he does anyone else.
Do you think it would be a pastoral comfort to believing faithful Jews that the promise said that I will be God to you and your children, and the promise of the new covenant comes to you and your children? Would that be a pastoral comfort
Acts chapter 2?
To Jews, period, that are faithful? All of the promises, I'm just saying that's one statement of it. There's plenty of other promises, God to you and your children throughout the Old Testament.
In Acts chapter 2?
Throughout any part of the Bible. Does that promise give pastoral comfort to anyone who's lost a child in infancy?
The pastoral comfort to anyone who's lost a child in infancy is the God of all the earth will do right. It's his freedom.
Not being God to you and your children. So you would say it does not, being God to you and your children, the promises to you and your children, in no way is relevant to a person who loses a child in infancy.
You and your children in the New Testament, I've already mentioned, is defined. The seed and the offspring are those who are according to faith. That's not an issue in regards to coming up with pastoral concern in a hospital room. I do not believe you can say, well, on the basis of how God treated the Old Testament Jews, that means you can assume upon God's grace. No, I don't believe that.
I'm going to move to another topic. But that's not the question. My question is, if the Bible's telling us a radical change on this point, why do you, in your understanding, this is 9 individuals, 5 are household cases, and 2 don't have households, and you've got Simon and you've got Gaius. That's a very unpromising set of statistics for someone who's claiming a radical individualistic change, in my view, but I'm asking you, why do you think
I don't accept the language of radicalistic individualistic change. I don't accept those numbers. There were 3,000 individuals who were baptized on the day of Pentecost. Nothing about infant baptism and nothing about household baptisms and all of those. So that becomes 3,000 versus 5. Now the numbers are on my side. So it all depends on how you count it. I mean, seriously. So it was radical, for example, to go from the circumcision of men to the inclusion of women on the very basis of baptism. That was a radical thing, but I don't remember seeing all of the protestation at that time. So I'm sorry. I don't accept that idea.
You can ask me about that in a moment. But
So let me say here, in my opinion, the debate blows open when Gregg starts bringing up the infant salvation thing, because that really shows the purpose behind his reasoning. And to me, it comes off as unbalanced, that he was really justifying his pastoral concerns, that he wanted to be able to tell parents that their mentally handicapped child, that their two little children, they can be assured of their salvation. And how does James address this? It shows the emotional influence that this has had on Gregg, and doesn't bode well for his argument, I have to say. Of course, James keeps his cool, and James usually takes a high stance. If there's a knock on James White, it's that he typically takes a I'm offended stance, if not openly, passively, so keep that in mind, and that's how he blows off that general questioning from Gregg. Again, I don't think it bodes well for Gregg. I don't think James had a particularly fantastic rebuttal to him, but it did not help Gregg's case. In this section, not that you heard it in these, James also addresses the household question immediately. So as soon as Gregg brings up the household question, James immediately gives that good jab about the 3,000, which you did hear, and that I brought up in the beginning. So James did not miss the fact that Gregg was ignoring the 3,000 that were baptized and did not talk about their households. So the numbers are with him. Lastly, in this section, I think important to note is that White asks, what sign for children was between Adam and Abraham? This I didn't show you a clip of, but it was a point where Gregg was at a loss for words, because there is no sign for the children of believers between Adam and Abraham. There was no circumcision, there was no baptism, and if we are assuming that there must be something that follows circumcision, because there's always a sign for children, there wasn't between Adam and Abraham, which leaves Gregg more or less without an answer. So I'm going to play for you a rapid fire of 4 different highlights from this debate. These will be moments that I thought were particularly punchy. I could shorten them, but I thought I'd give you a little more context in each clip. This is just to show you the general metering out of the debate. And again, the most interesting part of it was in the cross-examination, which is usually the case.
Would you object to someone asking a Muslim in your debate to join with us and say the Lord's Prayer? Would you object to that?
I would.
Okay. Do you have your children in Reformed Baptist Church pray the Lord's Prayer?
Well, they certainly join in the congregational prayers in the sense of showing respect for them. We certainly ask them to lead them. But
would you ask a Muslim to join in with you in the
no,
Lord's
because
Prayer?
they've already made a profession of faith that is in opposition to Jesus Christ.
So if they haven't made a profession of faith in opposition, they're in the status of covenant children?
There's no such thing as a covenant child in the New Testament, so I don't even know how to answer that question.
Well, you just said
parallel a Muslim with it really makes me very confused.
If a Muslim were here and we were saying, would you pray with me the Lord's Prayer, you would object. But if a child of a Christian is here and we pray the Lord's Prayer, would you go to him and treat him the same way the Muslim?
And again, I pointed out, I think very clearly, that a Muslim has made a specific profession of faith that is contrary to the Lordship of Jesus Christ. They are worshiping a different God. But at least in our church, we have not given them covenant signs that have nothing to do with the reality of their profession, that then cause them to think that they're righteous before God.
When you speak to such children, do you confirm them in an identity of being an unrepentant unbeliever, though they are saying all the things like, I love Jesus, reciting catechetical questions and answers, all of these sort of things? Do you say to them, that's a lie, you're lying?
Of course not.
Why not?
Because we want to be used as the means of grace to bring the reality of those promises to them. We trust that the Holy Spirit of God can make that clear to his people. And sadly, we see sometimes the hardening of individuals against those things, but that's what God's electing grace is all about.
You include little children in his people?
We include little children in the services. I'm not including them in the new covenant, no.
You just said his people. Was that just a...
I don't remember what the context. What do you mean?
When a child says these sorts of things of Christian identity and faith, you tell them they're liars. You say, you're lying. You say, Jesus loves me, this I know. You are a liar. That's the language is parallel to Moses. All the way through the book of Hebrews is parallel to the Old Covenant. How much more? That is a perpetual argument through Hebrews. That is a comparative.
You don't see the how much more? You see the how much more as a defining parallel rather than a disjunctive parallel?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, it sounds like you're saying to me that the mediatorial work of the Son of God based upon his perfect atonement is to be defined within the categories of Moses' role as mediator for the people of Israel, rather than completely transcending and exploding those categories.
Well, I believe it's transcending, but what I'm pointing out is, when Hebrews is written, it says, bear with the word of exhortation, don't shrink back to destruction, 10:30, don't come short of the grace of God, 12:15, don't be like Esau who was rejected and found no place for repentance, 12:16 and following, don't neglect no so great a salvation, chapter 2, verse 3, those who have once been enlightened, have tasted the heavenly gift, have been partakers of the Holy Spirit, and have tasted the good word of God, and then have fallen away, 6, not to be like the ground which yields thorns and thistles, it's worthless. And
we know there are apostasy passages. We know there are apostasy passages. I'm talking about Jesus' ability to save his people, and you're talking about what sounds like the ability of people to be in the new covenant and not be saved by their mediator. And I'm not seeing the connection here. In Hebrews chapter 7, we are told he is able to save forever those who draw near to God through him. Is it your assertion that there are members of the new covenant that do not draw near to God through Christ?
Yes. In the new covenant, let me say it this way to give a picture. Someone would ask, well, does baptism save the child? I'll say, baptism functions like a wedding functions to a marriage. Does a wedding marry a couple? Yes, it marries them, but that's not to be confused with the wedding itself is a good marriage. A good marriage may result from a good wedding. It may not. A good wedding, if someone obeys it, follows all the vows, does what is represented in a beautiful wedding, then a great marriage will result. However, we all know that just a good wedding doesn't produce a good life of a marriage. And so it is a good baptism. If everything was perfectly said, whether in adulthood or in infancy, a good baptism doesn't necessarily create a good, faithful life. But what it does do is it does begin the process. And I would say the best way to understand that is covenantally.
Well, I'm awful glad I remember my wedding and the vows that I made, because they've been foundational to the faithfulness that I've exercised toward my wife ever since then. And if that was arranged for me and I didn't even know it happened, I think that would fundamentally impact how I viewed my responsibilities in weddings.
So hopefully those clips gave you a good idea of how the debate went. In the second half, I'm going to say that the totally cordial debate, strong open from both sides. I think that Gregg gave a strong open with his story of covenantal theology, but the cross-examination portion of this debate clinched it for Dr. White. And like I said in the beginning, the first to sweat is usually the first to lose. And Dr. Gregg, or Reverend Gregg, I shouldn't use titles. Gregg did not keep the debate emotionless. Not that you have to be emotionless. I think James also showed emotion in this debate, but he was the first to sweat, first to start getting angry, and therefore was the first to lose. If you want to see more of this kind of content, I'll be coming out with debate reviews like this every week. Again, Christian debate, short response. If you want to check out more from the Found Cause podcast, you can go to facebook.com/foundcause, where we'll be posting all of our long-form, hour-long episodes. You can also see our videos up on YouTube, and of course, we have a Twitter as well at @found_cause. That's new, so hopefully I'll remember to plug it. Thanks for listening. If you have any ideas for debates that I should review, of course, leave them in the comments of YouTube, Facebook, or at us on Twitter. I'd be happy to see your debate suggestions. I've got a big lineup of a bunch of James White debates, so hopefully I don't just give you James White in the next couple weeks. Until next time, this has been The Found Cause. Thanks for listening.